Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of culture in the 1950s. In this final lecture, we're going to talk about perhaps the most famous and in some ways notorious instance of the counterculture in American culture, rock and roll music. A unique cast of characters made perhaps their biggest impact in rock and roll music in the 1950s. In the late 40s and into the 50s, the popular musical styles featured smooth-voiced crooners like Bing Crosby, Perry Como, and Dean Martin. Even in the 1940s, though, there were hundreds of smaller labels that pushed alternative artists. Independent companies, who pressed only a few hundred records at a time, were able to push the boundaries of what was acceptable, churning out records that some considered loud, racy, or morally questionable. Radio also played an important role in the rise of rock and roll. With the advent of television, many radio executives turned to specialized, segmented audiences. Rather than continuing to appeal to families sitting around the radio for hours on end, many turned to playing records of a few minutes in length. Disc jockeys were also important. Many of them came to be considered the focal point of the radio station, so some of them became powerful enough to play different types of music. Some of them turned to playing black music in the early 1950s. Alan Freed, on Cleveland's WJW radio station, began playing R&B records given to him by a local record store owner. Soon, white teenagers were calling the show making requests. DJs around the country soon began to realize that whites would listen to black music as well. This also coincided with the rise of a teenage subculture. There were neighborhood recreation centers where teens could hang out, listen to music, dance, and play games. Teenagers were becoming an important demographic. Even by 1945, 17 magazine had over 1 million subscribers and was becoming a force in advertising. Businessmen began targeting teens as consumers. Most often, though, kids listened to what they wanted to listen to. They spurned the advice and influence of adults. They were drawn to rock and roll. There were songs focused on being young and the challenges of growing up. There were songs about romance and sex. Rock and roll echoed the sexual innuendo of R&B, and in fact, rock was a synonym for sex. Critics of rock and roll questioned its sexual suggestions as well as its origins in black music. But most white performers admired black musicians and did aspire to be more like them. As one white musician said about visiting the black section of Memphis, "I drove down Beale Street in the middle of the night. I was flabbergasted. It was rockin'. It was so active, musically, socially. God, I loved it." Rock and roll was the music of integration. Chuck Berry, a leading black performer, performed to audiences that were thoroughly integrated, and white and black both loved it. Black artists also listened to white music. Ray Charles performed for a time with an all-white country backup band. Many rock and roll singers came from racially or socially outcast groups. They were raised poor and had few other options. But they also had a ready audience in other people like themselves. Teenage kids were drawn to them. Elvis Presley became rock and roll's far and away biggest selling artist. He accounted for 10% of all music sales in 1956. That year, he had 5 of the top 9 songs of the year and sold 75,000 albums a day. Don't Be Cruel was number 1 for 11 weeks. Elvis was young, southern, and poor, like many other rockers of that time. He was born in 1935 in Tupelo, Mississippi, and called himself white trash. At age 13, he moved to Memphis. His family was simply looking for some kind of opportunity. Presley got his start at Sun Records, a small independent studio in Memphis, owned by Sam Phillips. Phillips welcomed aspiring singers, and often uneducated singers. It was also a pioneer disc jockey, Dewey Phillips, at the Memphis station W.H.B.Q., who first played Elvis on the radio and dubbed him a hit. That's All Right was his first hit song. Phillips played the song 7 times in a row and gave Elvis his first radio interview. Elvis was also influenced by race. He paid respect to black musicians and acknowledged his debt to them. In 1956, he said, "The colored folks have been singing it and playing it just like I'm doing now, man, for more years than I know. And nobody paid them no mind till I goosed it up. I got it from them." Elvis also reflected the importance of young people to rock and roll. He'd always been something of a rebel. He wore his hair slicked in a wave with long sideburns. He once was kicked off the football team for not cutting his hair. His success was also due to hard work. He played many nights on the road in small southern towns and kept refining his sound, noting the reaction of the audience. This responsiveness led him to increasingly risky sexual grounds. On the one hand, he toyed with his own gender. He often wore pink when on stage. His hair was long. He sometimes wore mascara and makeup, and blue eyeshadow. Presley helped to create an androgynous side of rock music that later influenced Mick Jagger, David Bowie, and countless others, including pretty much all of the hair bands of the 80s. Elvis also began humping, bumping, and grinding his hips on stage. His drummer actually rehearsed by playing for burlesque shows in which the drummer hits an accent when the performer thrusts. He did the same with Elvis. Sexuality stirred feelings with his audience, especially teenaged girls. Good church-going and school-going girls who were still contemplating sexual freedom. They went to black juke joints and admired the dancing. They went out on the weekends and experimented. At Elvis's concerts, young women behaved as if they had been sexually unleashed. It was not uncommon for them to fall on the floor, panting and heaving. Elvis described his own experience on stage as something close to orgasmic. "It's almost like making love. Hell, I don't calm down till 2 or 3 hours after I leave the stage. Sometimes I think my heart is going to explode," Elvis said. Elvis did inspire much controversy in the mainstream press. He was considered distasteful, at least, dangerous and sinful, at worst. There were record smashings, picketings, and in some towns his performances were banned. All of this contributed to his soaring popularity and record sales. Perhaps the strongest objections came from within the music industry itself, where the major labels saw their position slipping to smaller independent companies. As the percentage of rock and roll on the radio rose, the percentage of hit records produced by the major labels declined. Crooners balked. Frank Sinatra fumed. "Rock music is the most brutal, ugly, desperate, vicious form of expression it has been my misfortune to hear." Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. also complained. Davis said, "If rock and roll is here to stay, I might commit suicide." Two developments sparked the revival of major labels. In 1947, Bell Labs developed the transistor, which meant that radios could be much smaller than using electron tubes. Portable radios by the early 1950s began to appear, often in cars. Young people now had an even greater opportunity to listen to rock music away from adult supervision. And in 1950, RCA produced the first 45 RPM records. These were perfect for rock and roll recordings of just a song or two, and ideal to carry around. And in late 1955, RCA Victor bought Elvis Presley's contract from Sun Records. In 1956, he appeared on The Milton Berle Show, The Steve Allen Show, and finally The Ed Sullivan Show. His movie career also began in 1956. He was guided by Colonel Tom Parker. Under Parker, Elvis's dangerous image was toned down just a bit. He still had his sex appeal, but at the height of the Cold War, he was also presented as 100% American. When he entered the Army in 1958, he became a bona fide American hero. By the late 1950s, Elvis was an industry unto himself. Also by the late 1950s, the major studios had reclaimed leadership of the industry. A top 40 playlist was implemented by most radio stations, which restricted the number of different songs that were being played. But in 1958, a black entrepreneur named Berry Gordy started his own record label called Motown. He borrowed $800 to start it. In the 1960s, Berry Gordy and Motown would earn more than $61 million. But that's a story for another lecture and another time, when we talk about popular culture in the 1960s.